Right, thank you for coming to my talk on HPPD. I'll introduce myself. That slide has got my introduction. So, yes, my name is Ed, and I'm a master's student at the University of East London in psychology. By background, I'm a journalist, and I originally covered history and culture, and then as psychedelics became more and more of a mainstream concern, I shifted my focus onto psychedelics. And I've covered them largely in a positive way, discussing their potential and their metaphysically interesting qualities, which I had experienced myself, but I'd also experienced this effect for then 6 years that I never disclosed publicly, even though I was, at least on Twitter, a public commentator on psychedelics. And then in September last year, I opened up in a thread about how I have had HPPD since I was 17, and I'm now 24. And then after a fairly striking weed experience, I decided to just really go for it and try to become the HPPD man, which is probably the best description I can give for my actual job. I work for this organisation called the Perception Restoration Foundation, which was founded by two HPPDers in 2020 and then launched publicly in 2021, that September. So it's kind of a synchronistic constellation of events there. Did you want to go past?
Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. So we'll cover an introduction to HPPD, whose acronym I haven't yet outlined, but I will do so shortly. Why HPPD matters, what helps HPPD, and a possible CBT concept for HPPD. So my story. Here is me in maybe January 2016, flying on 2 tabs of acid, playing a sitar, because that's what you do if you're 17 and into the 60s. And at that point, I was thinking I was a bit of a professional. You know, I'd tripped 3 times before. I thought, you know, I knew what I was doing. You know, I was looking at the wall and seeing it melt again, and I was like, yeah, I'm a veteran here. And little did I know that within 36 to 40 hours, I would be first racked with the effects of HPPD, having had a fairly horrifying experience. So I've had HPPD, which I'll just define initially before a proper definition in the next slide, as basically ongoing visual disturbances following a psychedelic experience. And these visual disturbances are not actually well characterized or well defined. They can be incredibly wide-ranging, but I've had visual disturbances and dissociative effects, specifically the depersonalization, derealization, which have been discussed in Martha's talk and in the conversation, for 7 years following my LSD experiences. And like any mature late adolescent, I did the right thing and carried on tripping after getting HPPD. And that certainly didn't help the HPPD, and it certainly didn't help the derealization, which is still very much, thankfully not the last few months, but it's very much a present feature of my psychological life, all these years later still. So as I said, by background I'm a journalist. I'm doing my master's in psychology, and in the dissertation I'm doing research into HPPD. I work for this foundation. And yeah, as I didn't mention earlier, I got interested in psychedelics in 2015 or so, having already had a background interest through the Beatles in the 1960s and Hendrix and etc. And then when I saw the first headline of a Johns Hopkins study suggesting that, you know, if you took mushrooms you could have an experience as meaningful as the birth of a first child or your wedding day, I thought that was carte blanche really to go on a grey market website selling 1p LSD, a research chemical, and get it through the post, and then just eat that tab right up. So what is HPPD? HPPD it stands for Hallucinogen Persisting Perception Disorder, and this is a DSM-5 term. The specific terminology has evolved over time. It was originally called post-hallucinogen perceptual disorder, but it's now called HPPD. And I will not use the DSM-5's own definition, because I think that it has a number of flaws, which I'll describe later. But basically, at its simplest, at the most fundamental level, HPPD is when you take psychedelics and your visual perception is then changed after the drugs have worn off and you're sober, so for extended periods afterwards. Although there hasn't been particular work on defining how long these effects should last to merit a diagnosis of HPPD, but nonetheless, but critically, these visual perceptual changes should cause you distress and impairment. And this is a criterion that's involved in all sorts of mental diagnoses, that you have to have some quality of distress, or occupational dysfunction, interpersonal dysfunction, reductions in quality of life. And this is very much a possible secondary effect of these visual perception effects. So perhaps I'll outline the kinds of things that I experienced at its most significant. So I took this LSD, and then I noticed a few days later that the carpet at school was starting to sort of glitter. And that was hang on. Actually, I think in a following slide I have a bigger list, so maybe I'll switch up the order. But it's not a never-ending trip, which is an unfortunate fear that many HPPDs internalise, not necessarily assisted by some of the conservative messaging about psychedelics and frying your brain, etc. So yes, some of the basic visual effects you can experience with HPPD, which all of which I've experienced. So visual snow. So to return to my story, I began noticing a few days after this LSD trip that the carpets were covered in static. This kind of static you see on an undialed analog television, the fuzzy sort of graphic. And I was seeing it all over the carpets, all over the blank surfaces, everywhere, in a way that seemed entirely novel and striking. Because people in this room might have experienced sort of visual snow and visual static before. It's basically a fairly normal perceptual phenomenon. Maybe if you look at this wall there, blank surface, you might notice a slight graining quality. But it seems that with HPPD, this existing perceptual tendency is just ramped right up. And some people's visual snow, and I've got some graphical depictions later on in the presentation, some people's visual snow is so severe, it's functionally debilitating. After images, this is when you look at an object and you look away, and there is a sort of, it can either be negative or positive, it can be sort of a reversed, inverted colour effect. So I could look at that laptop, thankfully not happening right now, but I could look at this laptop and look away, and there'd be a neon green or a neon blue silhouette or after image of the object, and I look away. And I'll never forget a story I saw in the HPPD subreddit of a guy sitting at an exam, and he looked over at his friend's test paper, and then looked away, and then he saw an exact representation of his friend's paper, so he could copy the answers. Which is one of the rare positives that people actually halos. This is when you look at an object and it has a sort of aura, concentric ring around it. You can have halos around lights, which some of you might have experienced, is like maybe, and halos, they're qualitatively related to the phenomenon of auras, which some of you might have experienced or heard about through migraine with aura. Halos for me, I began noticing them actually with a bit of a delay. Just sat in a university seminar room trying to concentrate, and I looked up and I just saw that everyone's heads were completely surrounded by these like rainbow neon green trim. And then it sort of developed over time into just looking at anyone, they would have a sort of silhouette around them, these halos, geometric patterns. So this is some of the psychedelic specificity of HPPD people can experience, by which I mean that what makes this hallucinogen, persisting perception disorder, is that I'd be looking at the carpet in a lecture or something, and I would then see paisley patterns, the same kind of things I saw tripping. Visual movements, classic things might be the things you experience tripping, like breathing walls, melting walls. So there's this broad distinction that's been made since about 2001 between type 1 and type 2 HPPD, where type 1 HPPD is when it's episodic, it's a transient visual experience that's usually not distressing, and that corresponds to the classic notion of the flashback, which I think is significantly overloaded at this point, and is laden with so many assumptions that it's not necessarily a particularly helpful term. But type 2 HPPD is what most people tend to experience, where it is this persistent, day-to-day, if not constant, visual experience. And there hasn't been any work on sort of working out the respective prevalences of type 1 or type 2 HPPD. Some people might have them both are dependent on certain triggers. So for instance, if I went back into my parents' living room, which is where I'd taken LSD before and tripped out on its interior, my HPPD would be wrapped up based on associations and memories. So the condition, as I said, is situational. It's not just, whilst people can have a constant level of visual disturbance, the intensity of the visual disturbance will fluctuate. So HPPD seems like it would just be a condition of abuse. People who just take one trip, I'm going to get this. This is something that affects, real acid heads or ayahuasca addicts. But no, this is something that can happen from a single experience at a relatively low dose. So I know 3 people who have developed HPPD from microdosing. Mine was my 4th trip. I know there are plenty of reports of people having had a single psychedelic experience years ago and still having constant visual disturbances. I would say that broadly, it's more likely with challenging psychedelic experiences or bad trips, and we'll go into this later in relation to the effects on anxiety and, as Marta described in her presentation, the dysregulating effects on the nervous system of an incredibly anxiety-inducing or overwhelming trip. Abuse, I'll put my hand up and I'll say that I was not necessarily respecting the 1P LSD research chemical when I took it 2 weekends in a row, 2 tabs, even though the weekend before I'd had a pretty uncomfortable experience too. And I would say certainly a probability of getting HPPD is more likely if you just keep tripping. And even noticing that you might be starting to see certain visual anomalies and you just keep tripping. And use at young ages. There hasn't been real research on the age-based predispositions or prevalences of these phenomena, but nevertheless it seems anecdotally that young ages are a strong risk factor for HPPD. So if you go on the HPPD subreddit or the HPPD online forum, there'll be plenty of posts by teenagers, sometimes as young as 14, who just took a really impulsive decision, stupid decision to trip, and are then racked with this condition they'd never even heard of. There are non-visual components to HPPD, which is what makes it really a concept in need of something of a paradigm shift, which is why I'm sort of working on the disorder as a researcher, because people consistently report non-perceptual symptoms, such as a general ambient anxiety and sometimes panic disorders that seem to have just happened in concert with the visual disturbances, like they're part of the same package. Depersonalization, derealization, which can run in a mutually reinforcing cycles with the visuals. Because already if you're feeling sort of on the edge of derealization or depersonalization, and then you look around and you're just seeing a visual field just coated in psychedelic-like phenomena, it doesn't necessarily reinforce a sense of reality. Tinnitus, that seems to be pretty common. Somatic effects. For me, I would compare these somatic effects to the unusual feelings and sensations you can experience meditating. This feeling of I suppose what's being summed up in phrases like chi or prana, just this weird sort of energy I'm able to just feel in my body. But also it has things like head pressure, which is a very common symptom. People with HPPD, just out of nowhere, they feel like their head's exploding all the time. People can feel psychedelic-like visual effects, like a body high, and cognitive changes. The cognitive components of HPPD or cognitive associations of HPPD especially haven't been researched, but people report things like brain fog or difficulties reading, which can also be related to the functional debilitation of trying to read when the letters are literally moving around and swimming. Which is a severe end of the spectrum. I thankfully have been spared. Again, as I said, these things are really under-researched. And it's hard to separate HPPD symptoms from stress and anxiety. As I'll discuss later, if only because HPPD as a diagnosis is given when it's accompanied by distress and reductions in quality of life, And also, as I'll talk about later, anxiety itself, in the absence of any drugs, has visual disturbances as symptoms sometimes. So there are a number of neurophysiological theories for HPPD. The classic hypothesis for HPPD is the sort of overexcitation theory. And this was formulated in the early 80s by a guy named Dr. Henry Abraham. And he supposed that LSD, specifically, because his population was specifically based on LSD experiences, caused an overexcitation in relevant neuronal circuits, such that the brain's ability, that after this overexcitation, which he calls a toxic damage, the ability for the visual system to filter out visual noise is reduced. It's a condition of decoupling of the filters. And this could be related to neuroplasticity, which is a concept that's increased in currency since Abraham was an active researcher, that you make your brain more malleable. Its cognitive, perceptual, affective centers are more alterable. And then, for whatever reason, possibly due to a lack of sufficient down-regulation after an experience, as Marta discussed, your perceptual centers do not return to as before. They are still, the plasticity has resolved in a different, perceptually distinct direction. And HPPD seems to, in its DSM-5 formulation, HPPD is defined as a re-experiencing of psychedelic phenomena, which can happen, but this definition seems to have its own sort of specificity, as if HPPD is in a category of its own. But no, it's actually deeply related to other perceptual and sensory conditions, and there is a question about whether HPPD really deserves its own category, or whether it needs to be dissolved into others. So another question is, how common is this? The first point to make is we don't actually know, but I think that we can say with some confidence that ideas that HPPD is extremely rare are unlikely to be true. So I used to see prevalent suggestions that this was maybe a phenomenon that affected 1 in 50,000 people. I think that's fairly unlikely. The last study that was done on prevalence was done by Matthew Baggett and colleagues at Erowid, and this was a survey of 2,500 psychedelic users, of whom 3 in 5 reported some kind of long-lasting visual effect from the use of psychedelics. And then 1 in 25 of this sample, it was 4.2% precisely, reported visual effects that were so intense they were considering going to a doctor, which is indicative of the diagnostic HPPD territory. HPPD is pretty little known. I've never been to a doctor about it, but plenty of people have, and perhaps not knowing what HPPD was themselves, they go, I took LSD, I began noticing these strange visual phenomena, and the doctor, if not clueless, might suggest a different diagnosis, like some kind of, I've heard of people being misdiagnosed with drug-induced psychosis, or even schizophrenia. I believe that was a particular problem in the 20th century with people experiencing HPPD. Treatments, we don't know much about that, but I'll discuss that later on. But one issue with misdiagnosis is that people can be given potentially the wrong kind of drug. So people, if they were diagnosed with drug-induced psychosis, might be given a drug like haloperidol or risperidone, antipsychotics, that are documented mainly to significantly exacerbate symptoms, possibly in a lasting way. As I said, misdiagnosis. Many of the treatments that are given, and where HPPD is accurately diagnosed, are laden with side effects and real risks. So the 2 main drug classes that are given are sort of anticonvulsants, like lamotrigine, usually given for epileptics, and that can be incredibly relieving for the symptoms, but it involves all sorts of side effects, and I decided not to take it because it can really exacerbate eczema and itching. And the other drug class is the benzodiazepines, which are highly addictive, as many people in the room will know. A point to make is that not everyone finds these visuals distressing. I was just talking to a gentleman outside who reported some kind of post-psychedelic visual phenomenon, and he said that he didn't find it particularly distressing. And many people don't find these visuals especially distressing. And Levine and Luke, two colleagues of mine, did a survey trying to understand what distinguishes distressing from non-distressing HPPD, and they found that trait anxiety, being predisposed to anxiety really, having had a negative precipitating experience or a bad trip, and then not knowing what HPPD was beforehand, were all risk factors for having HPPD that was distressing. And I certainly empathise with this. With the negative precipitating experience I had, it was a sense of never being able to escape from this bad trip. It was sort of constant reminders of whatever trauma I might have accumulated from the experience, and lack of informedness because I didn't know what the fuck was going on. And so your mind defaults to catastrophic conclusions like, shit, I've truly fried my brain. And thankfully my friends were very consoling by laughing at me. And things that were conducive to non-distressing HPPD, interestingly, were prior awareness and also this trait absorption, which is a trait, basically a personality faculty of immersing yourself in internal experiences. It might be a proneness or a fondness for daydreaming, an ability to be deeply consumed by music, for example. But really, in the crudest way, it could be that people who are high in absorption, when they see these visuals, are basically just able to sort of trip out and just enjoy it. And many people, anecdotally, like these visuals because it allows them to have free trips. And that's really cool. And maybe some people in the room have experienced these kinds of free trips. You know, you're lying in bed at night and you put on some Hendrix or something, and then you're seeing patterns, and you're like, this isn't so bad. But then the point that will become clear with the graphical depictions of HPPD is that it's probably dependent on the actual intensity of symptoms, whether the visual is distressing, as well as these kind of risk factors. But what this points to is that anxiety reduction and reframing these visuals can be a really powerful psychological treatment for HPPD. I'll discuss in a bit how HPPD is being viewed in a strongly biomedical brain-based way. You know, this is a drug-induced brain disorder. When really, if it's a disorder of distress, then it's also psychological, it's social and cultural. And given that psychedelics are a contested illicit drug class, it's also political. And what's really fascinating is that there are some case reports which you can, maybe 5 or 6 in total I found on HPPD, or as it was called in the 70s, persistent flashbacks, where basically through muscle relaxation and exposure to people's situational triggers for these panicky visual experiences, these therapists are able to guide these burnt out, unfortunate hippies, which are many of them, into basically not only reducing their anxiety but also eliminating their visuals, which is really fascinating. And so I'm very supportive of more research into psychotherapeutic techniques for HPPD, including the CBT, the acceptance commitment therapy, mindfulness, although mindfulness can exacerbate the depersonalization, derealization element. And I really, after Marta's talk, should have included some kind of somatic therapy. I think that would be vital for many people. Oh, I did. And somatic therapy. Right. I should probably mention that HPPD isn't just related to psychedelics. I thought I had a point in here, but obviously I didn't. Right, so whilst it's hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, and this brings to mind LSD, psilocybin, 2CB, DMT, all these drugs are very effective in producing HPPD, but non-strict hallucinogens like MDMA or ketamine or cannabis can also induce these conditions of visual disturbances. But most curiously, drugs like the SSRIs can also induce sustained visual disturbances. So that's another open question about the actual validity of HPPD as its own discrete category. Is, why are we focusing on the hallucinogens? What actually is the prevalence of visual disturbances for different drug classes? Are there differences in the kinds of visual symptoms people report based on the drug? Is it possible that people who got it from LSD report more rainbows and melting walls than someone who got it from sertraline, for instance? I would guess so. There does seem to be an interesting distinction between the kinds of HPPD people will report from DMT and 5-MeO DMT and LSD. So whether there's debate about whether 5-MeO DMT reactivations are really HPPD, but nevertheless, some of you in the room might have heard of 5-MeO DMT reactivations. These sound like true flashbacks, true re-experiences of drug states, but these are very distant cousins, the reactivations from, say, a classic LSD, visual, persistent, depersonalized kind of phenomenon. I mentioned earlier, it could basically be neuroplasticity gone wrong. In the same way people can report an afterglow long after a trip, in a sort of positive, emotional or affective-based lingering neuroplastic change, it could be that there can be perceptual changes based on the enhanced malleability of perceptual senses from a trip. And I think that there are ways in which you can manage the sort of neuroplastic re-entry induced once you come down from a drug experience. And I've called it the post-trip critical period to ensure that you maybe minimize your risk of developing lasting visual disturbances. So some of the hygienes that people can employ, which which I didn't practice myself too much, are good sleep. So I did not sleep a wink with my bad trip. And some people get it at festivals, which brings the additional risk of further drug taking, a lack of integration. So if you had a really shattering experience and you're still perhaps dysregulated and anxious, and the experience is generally unintegrated, I think that can have all sorts of pathways towards sustained visual disturbances and other effects. Disembodiment, which is a risk factor for depersonalization and derealization effects. Stress and anxiety, so if you go straight back into a high stress job, you're sort of inflaming your nervous system. Memory evoking environments, like if you had a really intense experience in your house, for example, and then you live in your house, you're going to be seeing the same things you tripped on, and I think and you're still neuroplastic for periods after a trip, and so your perceptual centers are still sensitive to these little suggestions by the environment. And then, as Marta indicated, a lack of proper nervous decompression and relaxation, I believe, is significant. So here are some recreations of HPPD. So this is someone riding a bike, a more colourful psychedelic style of HPPD. They look down and they see the flashes of colour, they see certain patterns emerging, they see these rainbow-like constellating effects in their shoes, there's visual static all over it. Here is a fairly extreme case of visual snow. Again, we don't know how common these extreme cases necessarily are. Here is a kind of HPPD that's more psychedelic in quality. You have an after image, and you also have the sort of pattern tessellating kind of psychedelic effect. People might have seen tripping, but it just carries on with some people's HPPD for years. I mean, there are case reports of people having had intense HPPD for 25 years, and we don't really know why. And here are some interesting pictures recorded in Dr. Henry Abraham's case notes. So here is a devil someone reported continuing to see, and this points to the extraordinary range of visual disturbances people can experience. As is clear from this devil, the visual hallucinations or pseudo-hallucinations can be more complex, they can be kind of anthropomorphic, although I assume these kind of things are a bit rarer. So you see someone says, patterns bug me, they look down and the sort of kitchen tiling suddenly emerges in a sort of psychedelic roar, as if they're tripping again. There's like a tunnel vision effect, we're walking down the hallway, they get trails which I've thankfully been spared from. They say dots, because visual snow was not yet in sort of common currency as a term yet, so people just saw it as these dots. And after images, you look at a lamp, you look away, and there's the lamp, again, still lingering. And the duration of after images people report can really vary. Like, thankfully, mine were never that long at its most severe. Some people's after images can last just several minutes, which is what makes HPPD potentially not just a psychological condition, but an actual neurological disability. A particular disability people might report is an inability to drive, inability to work, because you're functionally in a certain way visually debilitated. So why does HPPD matter now? Obviously there's a psychedelic renaissance, new clinical trials into the drugs, and thankfully full-blown HPPD has not occurred solely in the confines of a trial, but it has been observed partly in the MAPS MDMA trial, and you can hear about this in the podcast series cover story Power Trip, participant from a Canadian psilocybin trial who noticed certain unusual visual disturbances after the third dose, not knowing what this was and being given certain misinformation by the trial research staff. They then decided to continue relieving their depression through therapeutic use of psychedelics that then gave them full-blown HPPD. We don't really know what necessarily predisposes people or how we can manage the risks of HPPD. I mean, one thing that clearly has been successful is screening people's pre-existing experiences of unusual visual phenomena. So if you already have rich experience of visual static or after images, having never taken a psychedelic, that's probably a sign you're someone vulnerable. And most trials, if I'm correct, do ask about people's pre-existing visual disturbances. But nevertheless, as you sort of scale out, it's likely that with this minefield of a lack of knowledge of predispositions, we're going to step on some mines here. Rising population use. It's the highest psychedelic use for 40 years amongst college students in the US. It does seem that HPPD is more of a naturalistic phenomenon, so to speak. Many people, of course, are motivated by mental health concerns when they trip these days, especially among young people who are at higher risk. And you can draw a broad link to trait anxiety, as I've said before. So it's possible that the anxious people looking to try to get better through tripping are precisely those who might be more vulnerable to the HPPD afterwards. So here is, to change tack a bit, here is Glastonbury 1995, where I believe bands like, what was the band that did Common People? Pulp were playing, and someone I'm about to describe to you called Jay was in attendance at Glastonbury 1995. He decided to take a microdot, those kind of LSD tablets you saw back in the day. They don't seem too common nowadays. I mean, Jay had a pretty good trip, a strong trip, but then he noticed the following day that the ceiling of his tent was still looking extremely bizarre. I think he said it looked cathedral-like. And he decided, as any doctor would advise, to treat his lingering visual disturbance by taking large quantities of MDMA, which didn't necessarily help, because 25 years later, he is still racked with severe HPPD. So here are some of the phenomena that he described in the initial wave of intensity of the condition. And I think that the condition of this intensity lasted for several years. So after images lasted dozens of seconds, and my entire visual field flashed like a strobe light around 8 times a second. Perhaps worse than the visual issues were the intense feelings of still being on a trip. My thought processes were no longer linear. I felt like I was having multiple thoughts at once, thinking backwards, thinking sideways, and this was further compounded by an intense anxiety and depression. My GP didn't really want to know and just put it down to depression. I was put on Prozac, and this made me seriously ill. I drank a lot to try to cover the pain and would get blackout drunk 3 to 4 times a week. And this reminds me of a statistic that Dr. Henry Abraham show me once. But based on his consultations with thousands of HPPDs in the 20th century, really, because he was really the only HPPD doctor out there, and somehow people through their hook and crook and ingenuity tracked him down, and he observed that around 1/3 of the people he saw were alcoholics. And I think this is because the alcohol, possibly because of its GABAergic neurochemical effects, reduced the intensity of symptoms and finally put a blanket on the anxiety. Because people don't want to trip anymore because they don't want to make it worse. Well, often they don't. Smoking cannabis is a bit of a no-go because it can often be incredibly anxiety-inducing and exacerbate visuals. So the only drug they can really turn to, and especially because its legal status, is drinking. And someone who contacted me recently was someone I went to prep school with, and he's a young guy, I think a couple of years younger than me, and he contacted me because he had also developed HPPD and found my name, and even this young guy, was struggling with alcohol dependency. So it's a real concern. Here is Stan, Australia. He might be 44 now, but I spoke to Stan last year. He has very severe HPPD after an LSD trip in 1991. It was a period of LSD abuse, to be specific. He was taking LSD, I believe, at age 13, thanks to the zealous encouragement of an older brother, and who actually spiked him for this acid trip. And he has had incredibly intense HPPD ever since, and constantly struggles with thoughts of killing himself, and chronic anxiety, is unable to work, he's extremely isolated, he lives on disability benefits, he's impaired, he's isolated. I asked him what's the first thing you see in the morning, and he said billions of fucking dots everywhere. No human being can live like this, it's fucking torture. I don't know how you could deny this is real. And that is a genuine concern for the HPPD community, is the frequency, I think declining, thankfully, of people who deny that these kind of things happen, that they deny this condition exists. You can contest till the cows come home that the diagnostic, categorical, nosological validity of HPPD in the DSM-5, but at the end of the day, these experiences are incredibly real, and there is something to do with psychedelics here. But it seems that the culture is changing a bit, and people are a lot more open-minded to HPPD than they were even a few years ago. So how can we treat it? So the first thing to say again is that HPPD is defined by stress. So I have a friend who has very intense visuals, but he's actually pretty cool with it somehow. He's a big fan of the Grateful Dead. He's sort of a bit of a trippy guy in general, so then he just sort of rolls along with it. Work on the comorbids. This is the advice of Dr. Henry Abraham. It's pictured here. And by the comorbids, he means the depression, anxiety, and alcoholism that so often accompany significant HPPD. Because you can't necessarily do much to treat the visuals themselves, but you can treat sort of your mindset, you can treat your anxiety, and learn to maybe accept the condition. And living a happy life with these visuals is very possible. And stress and its downstream effects are huge aggravators of symptoms. So for instance, I've had many curious experiences of having maybe a stressful phone call, or having an intense conversation with my partner, and not only do I get stress-related eczema and itching, but then I'll look down and I'll see geometric patterns, which is a very curious correlation really. So the general folk wisdom in the community is that you need to accept this ASAP. You need to give it time and abstinence, focusing on the basic mental health hygienes that Marta talked about. Exercise, improve your sleep, good diet, focus on external tasks, because it's so easy once you're first wrapped with these visuals to sort of just lose track of what you used to do, because you're just constantly monitoring the visuals. You're like, shit, is it getting better? Oh no, is that symptom still there? And then really, I never went to a therapist when the first few years of the condition, but what really helped me was just getting into guitar and getting more and more into music as a kind of informal self-therapy. It really just distracted me, because walking around secondary school just in a certain way, like just tripping balls constantly, it was quite a lot, and it was good to get distracted. Prescription drugs, benzos and lamotrigine, as I mentioned earlier. And what's quite interesting is that benzodiazepine withdrawal symptoms, in the absence of any prior psychedelic use, can include visual disturbances like after images and static. And so it's curious that the drugs that they give people for HPPD, once you start withdrawing from them, could have given you HPPD without having taken any hallucinogens, so to speak. As I argued earlier, I think too much emphasis has been placed on the brain and biology, and there's been a huge neglected gap for psychosocial solutions. So yes, many people with HPPD isolate. In my experience, I didn't tell my family for a total of 5 years. I told a couple of friends. As mentioned earlier, they didn't really get it and just found it sort of funny that I was this guy who was a complete evangelist for acid. And I told them that it was safer than alcohol. I was like, what are you doing drinking? Why do you trip with me? And then a few months later I had HPPD, so they just found it more amusing. But I've only really opened up and been vulnerable with a few friends, and now my girlfriend. After telling my family, things got better. And people within the psychedelic community who are, especially the professional psychedelic community, can develop HPPD and be more prone to isolating because they're psychedelic people, and now they've got this shit, and they don't really want to spoil the party for themselves or for other people by opening up. And this isolating effect, which is strongly tied to anti-drug stigma, because if you try to tell people, well, I took LSD when I was a teenager and I still have trippy visuals, people will automatically, often a lot of the time, default to prejudices like, you're a burnout, you're a casualty, of course you should have known, you fried your brain. So then these sort of social, cultural factors can filter into people's inner experiences, the kind of automatic thoughts they have. I've got brain damage, I'm on a never-ending trip, I'm crazy, I'm a freak. So really, there's this continuity between the psychological, the social, and the cultural, and these problems mean that people can isolate in online forums, which are the only place where people can really... Sorry, go on. Yes.
Can I ask some questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm thinking here, I don't know if I missed any part of this explanation, but I was missing the part maybe that, do we know exactly, physiologically speaking, what happened in the brain? And if it is, if we know, there is a treatment for that, because also when I see all the symptoms and everything, where I come from, I'm from Brazil, and from shamanic perspective, for example, will be like pineal gland opening, the third eye, could be spiritual experience, I don't know, could be as well. So how do you guys deal with those kind of faith, and because could be leading to this direction as well, and how, as the researchers, they deal with those situations as well, because we have this contradiction, right? Yeah, I don't know, just
so
thinking.
Just to clarify, that the contradiction is between the shamanic understanding, where it could be, these visions are a sign of some kind of spiritual advancement, and on the other hand, viewing this as a pathology. Is that the contradiction you're alluding to?
Exactly.
Right, okay.
Yeah, exactly, because there is a very fine line in there.
Yeah, there
when
definitely
the
is.
monsters and everything, the visions of seeing people or seeing
Yes.
auras, it's really, we can relate it to a spiritual experience. Maybe you have the third eye open. I don't know.
Yes.
I don't have mine, but what I'm thinking is just like from the description of the symptoms, I'm guessing that could be correlated to a spiritual experience. And how can you make this distinction? It is from psychological, no, but physiological understanding better, like, there is no networking in the brain, and this is how we know it is not a spiritual experience, or how can you make sure this is really a problem?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I remember, and I'll get to that after answering your first question, like, do we actually know what's happening in the brain here? And then the answer is no. It's been really under research, and there was actually a planned brain imaging study on HPPD. They've since had to be abandoned because of lack of funding. But even then, I think the HPPD is insufficiently defined, such that even if we got a population of HPPD people from a forum and put them through a brain scanner, the question is, are these people sufficiently well correlated with each other to actually be a discrete category? Are we going to include people who got it from SSRIs too? Are they true HPPD? So one question is HPPD isn't defined well enough. It's not being taxonomized well enough as an actual discrete disorder to do that kind of neurophysiological research, in my opinion. But I think you pointed at a very important question, and it's something that I'm constantly conscious of, is avoiding pathologizing. Because even the name HPPD has the word disorder in it, and it's entirely possible that someone who otherwise could have been prone to accepting the condition and therefore avoiding getting it in the diagnostic sense of this being a distressing experience. But people say, there's this absurd situation where people on Reddit will say, oh, I enjoy my HPPD. But HPPD is defined as a distressing condition, so it sort of muddies the culture for people to talk about how their symptoms are distressing. But in answer to your specific question about the shamanic understanding, I would say I would only really agree with you that we don't know, and we need to continue being open-minded to these different perspectives.
Yeah, totally, I agree. I'm just thinking to understand also for these challenges that you might face, especially here, that we know exactly how it is, we know that we could be connected for some people that believe in more spiritual experience or not. So I think this is a very important topic, and I'm not saying that I'm very in favor of it, because it can be very much confused, I think.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very good observation, because people can lead, instead of bringing a psychologist to be treated, to be, because it could lead into suicidal thoughts, whatever. But on the other hand, he could go to a spiritual healer, I don't know, whatever, and develop some, some healing, or I don't know what gifts that the person believes that he has. Could be. I think we need to think of all possibilities, because, I think it's a very fine line.
I tried to contact these ayahuasca using communities particularly to ask them, do you observe sustained visual experiences amongst your ayahuasqueros, if that's pronouncing it correctly, or just amongst the users? And unfortunately didn't hear back, but I think there needs to be that kind of anthropological research.
But I think it goes back to the psychosocial aspect, because if it's happening in this context, yes, in a different context it would be different, but that's the problem. So it's not enough to help the individual people. The paradigm should need to change, the environment needs to change, the whole understanding of these things would need to be more destigmatized.
More talk about it.
Because that's what's making it difficult.
I have a slide later on where I discuss that one cultural intervention we need is really just to normalize visual oddities. I think we had this incredible aversion in the Western mental health paradigm, speaking broadly, to the idea of seeing things. But actually, the abnormal sensory experiences are remarkably common. I remember there's this really interesting research that suggested that I believe maybe even just across a lifetime, perhaps, around 10% of people will have vivid voice hearing. There was a survey of widows in Japan, of whom 3/4 reported vivid sensory re-encounters with their lost loved ones. And whilst these things aren't specifically related to HPPD, they point out that there are variations in sensory experience that we can't just simplify it. So, okay, that's a disorder, that's pathology. And some people, I think maybe a lot more people than are now, might be urged to enjoy or explore their visuals. So I'm really hoping to just, if not normalize, destigmatize these visuals. Anyone else have a question?
Just elaborate just a little bit, because you were interrupted right when we were talking about the forums impeding recovery.
Yes. So because people often feel uncomfortable sharing about HPPD even in psychedelic communities, because there's a risk of being minimized or told that the condition doesn't exist. People find great difficulty opening up to their family because they don't want to be prejudiced or especially for a teenager, like genuinely punished. So I never told any teachers at my school because any admission of any kind of drug use would spell instant expulsion. So I just basically kept it to myself. And so therefore, the only place you can sort of open up about HPPD is in anonymized, usually anonymized online forums. But the more you spend time in these forums, the more you basically become a bit of a hypochondriac. You become obsessive about your symptoms. You start developing sort of codependent relationships with other forum members. Checking in of, how are your symptoms doing right now? Oh, mine are terrible. And people who recover tend to leave the forums, and so the forums are populated usually with incredibly negative stories. And the hypochondria is a real thing. People will post like, oh, I've noticed a weird feeling in my leg or whatever. Is that HPPD? Because HPPD has been sort of ill-defined, and the moment we sort of open it up to there might be non-visual symptoms, people will then attribute everything to HPPD. And there's I'm friendly with the woman who runs the HPPD forum, and she says that the HPPD subreddit is the only recovery subreddit that actively encourages its members to leave. But at the same time, they can be very helpful. So the guy, Jay, I told you about earlier, he's been an active member since the early 2000s when HPPD Online was founded, and he provides loads of really good advice for people. And I think some of his advice is to get off this forum. And part of the psychosocial element is that we're living in a strange time for psychedelics. I think that there is an element of pro-drug propaganda in the psychedelic mainstreaming that's either equal to or greater than anti-drug propaganda at this point. Perhaps that's controversial, but it seems that the drug narrative around psychedelics now is broadly incredibly favourable. And what's interesting to me is that even the Daily Mail, which is the arch British tabloid, is basically very favourable to psychedelics and will happily repeat the press releases, essentially, of psychedelic research labs or companies. And there's also this trend of psychedelic exceptionalism, which is this belief that psychedelics are fundamentally different to other kinds of drugs, and therefore the psychedelic users they're not like drug users like other people. We're better. And we also live in a time of intense yearning for spiritual and psychological breakthroughs. People often feel a sense of meaninglessness, what's been called the meaning crisis. Nowadays, there's a loss of GPS, really, for individuals and the culture at large. And so people are drawn to psychedelic experiences in this cocoon of media hype, so to speak. And all this favorability around psychedelics means that discussing these sort of side effects and these problems, it can be difficult. But thankfully, because of forums like this, things are opening up. But basically, all these factors above mean that HPPDs can be really sad if they can't use the drugs again, especially if the experiences that gave them HPPD were like incredibly meaningful trips. So you have this I'm not sure if it's technically cognitive dissonance, but certainly a dissonant quality, because I can look back at my trips and think, these are some of the most powerful experiences of my life, but then I just see day to day the lingering imprints, and it's hard to sort of have a consistent sense of self-concept or a narrative or an arc. And it's like the same tools that gave me these incredibly powerful experiences were also quite damaging. It's really hard to reconcile that tension. And so some people are drawn to tripping again, as I was when I was 19. So 19 to 21, I used psychedelics more regularly than ever before. And it didn't necessarily help the HPPD or depersonalization, but it's not necessarily bad to use psychedelics again. So something really interesting is that some people can actually cure their HPPD through more tripping. Some people even yes, go on.
I have a tiny little question because it came up very often.
Yeah.
How old are the usual people who get HPPD? Because so far it always sounded like people somewhere around the end of their teenage, the beginning of their 20s. And are there many cases of people who are 25 and upwards? Because from everything I've read so far, it is before 25 your brain is not fully developed, and you're just so much more likely to get into the really negative side effects, like the fine little psychosis, your HPPD, and you also sound like you were 17. Jesus, way too early, man.
It was. There's not been specific research on the age distribution of HPPDs, but I've certainly heard of people getting it in their late 20s or early 30s. There's actually, I believe there was a member of the forum I encountered the other day who got it like sort of drawn to psychedelics now because of the new research and stuff, and then gave themselves HPPD. One of the people I know got it from a microdosed in their late 30s, and they got the HPPD. Yes. We have a question?
Please finish your sentence.
Yes, but I think that's certainly, as you say, it's people who are late adolescents to up to 25 will be more vulnerable. I'm especially concerned about the adolescents because I spoke to this particular teenager who got HPPD, and he says that in his high school, psychedelics are just crazily popular because of the new research and hype and using it for spiritual and mental health purposes. And he has seriously intense HPPD, and it's concerning. And part of my work is I get emailed by local social workers who tell me who ask me to chat to or meet up with local teenagers who develop HPPD. It's really dispiriting to see people.
Is this related to the development of the brain? Because we know that the brain develops until 25 years old. Is this affecting more because of this age, and then damage something there better than when you're older, or there is no correlation to that?
I would say, again, the question of neurodevelopment and how psychedelics affect with HPPD has not been studied, but I would say intuitively it makes a lot of sense because of the developing brain.
Do you still have a question?
I'm curious if you know if it primarily happens to people who are psychedelically naive, or like, should I still be cautious?
When you say psychedelic naive, do you mean who use it for the first time?
Yes.
Right. Again, I'm going to have to plead we don't know. But then there is, of a similar kind to the statistic I mentioned earlier, that 1/3 of Henry Abraham's patients were alcoholics. He noticed that there was a pretty clean, equal distribution in how many trips people took to develop HPPD, such that he suspected there was a genetic predisposition that was the number of doses dependent. So he noticed that around 1/3 of his patients would get it after maybe 0 to 5, after 1 to 5 trips, and then again like a sort of 5 to 15, and then there'll be a group of very heavy users who do 30 to 100 plus, and they would then get it just out of nowhere. But then, as you could probably tell, these are very wide-ranging estimates, not particularly well-defined. But the distribution was compelling enough for him to say that there was these distinctions he could make. So some genetic research would certainly be valuable. But again, I have an automatic skepticism because I'm not sure that HPPD is sufficiently well defined. That's an issue that's affected a lot of mental health genetics research. Is this issue of comorbidities of autism is highly related to ADHD, for instance, and you see that with other conditions. And I haven't mentioned yet the syndrome of visual snow syndrome, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. But its symptoms are often highly similar to HPPD. So it's another question of would people have got it anyway? Question.
What's the distinction and the difference between HPPD and then depersonalization, derealization?
Right.
Is it always with depersonalization, derealization? Or could it be that HPPD is you having a trauma flashback because you're also depersonalized and derealized?
Right.
Like what's the...
I would suspect that with more careful research and sorting on the symptoms, we'll see that people can have different directional relationships between depersonalization, derealization, and their HPPD symptoms. But to return to your first question of depersonalization, derealization does not always occur for people with HPPD. I think that there was a paper by some Dutch researchers who looked at every published case report, and I think it was 1/3 of the people in total had indicated depersonalization, derealization. So it doesn't necessarily affect everyone, but people, I mean myself included, didn't initially have depersonalization, derealization. It then happened later, and now my visuals reinforce it. So things can happen with in funny ways. But yeah, I think that it's a very valuable question about whether this is trauma related, especially with the idea of there being flashback experiences people have, which and often people report that the depersonalization, derealization is the most troubling symptom. You know, you can learn to live with static and some trails, but then a persistent feeling that the world around you isn't real is something else entirely. And so Henry Abraham, who I've spoken about a few times, actually suggested that that psychedelics, that the kind of disinhibition, he called it, the decoupling of filters that you observe in HPPD with the perceptual system might affect other systems in lingering ways. So the sense of self is decoupled. The sense of there being a structured conventional reality around us that you just know is real, it is decoupled. So now things feel dreamlike. And he also, based on his observations of how often people with HPPD just had severe anxiety disorders just sort of out of nowhere, in a way that seemed independent of the visuals. He suspected that was an affect of disinhibition. Things had been opened up, so to speak. Again, it's all quite speculative, which is mostly why I'm working on HPPD, to try and answer some of these questions.
You very quickly mentioned like the environment not being very happy for people to rain on the psychedelic parade. And I think that that's part of why this day is important at all. How do you, can you say more about that and how do you deal with that?
I honestly do think I honestly do think things are getting better. And also it's worth drawing distinctions based on the kind of psychedelic environments people find themselves in. So Reddit is, for what it's worth, a hugely influential and numerous community of psychedelic users, and the reaction to people posting about HPPD is bizarrely negative. In a forum like this, I feel very welcome and open. But for example, I'm posting an advert to recruit people from psychedelic-specific subreddits. Even Rational Psychonauts, the subreddit, incredibly negative. Maybe half of it buried the downvotes. If I posted on Drug Nerds, a subreddit of people discussing the psychopharmacology of psychedelics, trying to find people with HPPD to complete my survey, and just people saying, hey, HPPD isn't actually real. Just incredibly bizarrely negative. But in the professional space, it seems that things are more open. But the Reddit naturalistic use is where most of the psychedelic use is really happening. And it's for me personally, of course, it's a bit upsetting to hear people suggest that this isn't real, and it just causes people to further sink into an almost tribal mentality with the other members of the HPPD subreddit, because they're like, this is us against the idiot psychonauts who just don't know. And but then just generally on the topic of talking about serious difficulties like HPPD and psychedelic forums, well, I can't speak to what it might have been like 10 to 15 years ago, but I'd say, as I've said, generally I find that people are pretty welcoming, but it might be different sort of out there in the wild. I've never really hung out much with I don't know, ayahuasca communities or whatever. I wonder if it must be difficult for people there to say, I've actually started noticing some weird, distressing visual symptoms. Maybe afterwards I can talk to some people about if they've had that kind of experience. Just the final point there, other risks than HPPD are significant. So some people with HPPD, they carry on tripping and they think, oh great, my visuals aren't worse. Then they might get other stuff. Like me, as I've said, I didn't necessarily, I didn't start with depersonalization. That came with an ego dissolution trip, which is partly what motivated my contribution earlier. And the effects can come with delay. Yeah, my depersonalization derealization didn't initially happen like immediately after the trip. It then happened with a period of intense stress, and then this psychedelic-like depersonalization started happening. So I believe that the psychedelics are maybe more vulnerable to it. And part of the picture here is also biased studies and misleading headlines, which lead people to think that psychedelics are completely safe, risk-free, and especially teenagers will then be motivated to trip. So this is from an Imperial College London press release. Magic mushrooms reset the brains of depressed patients. Nature, no link found between psychedelics and psychosis. This is the famous chart by David Nutt and colleagues, which has LSD and magic mushrooms, an incredibly low level of risk. But interestingly, you see mushrooms here, LSD here, and buprenorphine, the opioid painkiller, whose withdrawal symptoms include death. They're secondly harmful. And then top left, psychedelics not linked to mental health problems or suicidal behaviour. And of course, once you start reading the studies, you see the subtleties and the methodological problems. But people don't read studies; they read headlines. And these kind of headlines, and it's clear that the way the headlines are written is done to market and attract clicks and readership to their studies, and it's concerning. And some in the research, this is actually there are some instances of outright HPPD denialism. So here is a quote from Krebs and Johansson: "There is no evidence of psychedelics leading to any kind of enduring perceptual disturbance, known as, quote, hallucinogen, persisting, perceptual disorder." And then if you go on like a sort of harm reduction website like DanceSafe, TripSafe, TripSit, or the Drug Policy Alliance, etc., HPPD is usually not covered, or it's dismissed as just merely rare or little known. So resources aren't that numerous for people out there. And the problem with headline culture is that what if it's irresponsible the other way? For those with HPPD, the acid trip never ends. When drugs fuck you up forever. The man who took LSD and didn't come down for 30 years. So people who are tripping forever. And these headlines are terrifying to see when you first get these symptoms. And so this is also an immediate problem. Critical for me was seeing these headlines in the first week after I got it, when I think I was probably quite sensitive still from the LSD. And then I see, never-ending trip. And I think that kind of injection of stress didn't necessarily help with the pathway my brain was going down. Destigmatization. Remember, some kind of visual effect from psychedelics may be surprisingly normal, but people don't talk about them, maybe because, especially in public, in non-psychedelic community, because they don't want to experiencing these visual effects, they then catastrophize and start thinking, no, fuck, I've got this thing, and they come across the concept of HPPD and they decide, I've got this thing now, and that's what. But whereas if psychedelic induced visual effects were kind of more normalized or destigmatized, maybe the anxious person would be reassured of, oh wait, okay, these kind of visual effects are maybe relatively normal, and then so in this critical period after a trip, they might be less anxious, less all the kind of good things that Marta was talking about, and maybe the visuals will be less likely to linger. Yes.
Did you have the chance to also find out someone that had HPPD without having mushrooms or any other hallucinogen?
Yes, I have encountered people who have got it from the SSRIs, for instance, and also in contact on Instagram by someone who got HPPD-like symptoms from withdrawing from kratom. Which is a bit ominous because I recently bought a kratom. But then the question question is, are the visuals people report from protein withdrawal the same as HPPD?
Exactly, yeah.
Is it just, are they experiencing visual disturbances that overlap with it? And then there's another question of, but then some people crucially report psychedelic-like phenomena in the absence of any drug use.
Yeah, exactly.
So a girlfriend of my friend who developed HPPD experiences geometric patterns after sex, which I suppose is a nice bonus. But nevertheless, it's very interesting, and psychedelics, they're not bringing these kaleidoscopes out of nowhere, out of a vacuum. It's enhancing our perceptual system's pre-existing tendency to see geometry. So even there, the psychedelic specificity of HPPD is troublesome because, it's not, because geometry isn't psychedelic specific, or at least psychedelic exclusive. People in a breathwork session might trip balls without ever having used drugs in their lives. So I think really there's possibly an argument for just sort of wiping the slate clean of all these categories, or at least taking these categories very lightly and just focusing on each individual person's own experience and working out what their priorities are, what the nature of their trips were, how they're treating their nervous systems in light of the talks today. So these labels, they're often counterproductive. Right, so because people don't talk about these kind of visual effects in psychedelia, people might tend to catastrophize or feel isolated, or that they did something wrong, that their brain is broken, what's wrong with me, why does no one else feel these things? And I think this is especially important in this critical period after the trip, when your brain's still neuroplastic. And in this period, you probably want to avoid fixation, stress, and rabbit holing about HPPD after a trip. It's not a great way to decompress. As I mentioned, maybe I'm having too many animations or something. There you go. So yes, as I've alluded to throughout the talk, HPPD isn't as groggy as we thought. So it's defined in the DSM as a re-experiencing. That's not necessarily true, because people can have all sorts of symptoms they've never seen before. I'd never seen visual static, and yet here I am seeing it. I'd never experienced tunnel vision, but I've had that profoundly with HPPD defined broadly, and there are non-psychedelic causes. And HPPD isn't just, it's not just the issue of non-hallucinogenic drugs causing it. It's also continuous with other conditions. So it really isn't in its own box. So visual snow syndrome, whose symptoms include after images, visual snow, of course, depersonalization and anxiety, and therefore you can have a visual snow patient who might have just developed it out of nowhere, or after a particularly bad migraine, or maybe even having had it since birth, having exactly the same symptoms as someone who got it from LSD. But visual snow syndrome, curiously, is defined as not involving drugs. So it seems like an entirely artificial distinction, really. Epilepsy, PTSD, anxiety and panic disorders, migraine with aura. And so the question is HPPD drug-induced or is it drug-infused? Have drugs happen to have been the incidental cause, or happen to be there in the timeline? Have they maybe differentiated the symptoms somewhat to be more trippy, but is it still fundamentally the same entity as visual snow syndrome, especially? Yes.
So this means that can lead, if it's not treated, can lead into schizophrenia, for example, because then the visuals can get worse, for example, or no? It's
no. It's the point here was more that HPPD's symptoms overlap with a condition like schizophrenia. So I was reading this book, The Matter with Things, by Ian McGilchrist, and he has a chapter on schizophrenia and autism, and he outlines all these sort of case reports, and the symptoms of the schizophrenic patients he reports are strikingly HPPD-like, and also they consistently report depersonalization, derealization effects. But it's an interesting point, schizophrenia, because many people with HPPD are terrified that they trigger schizophrenia. Exactly. That's like a meme in psychedelia is, you don't want to trigger schizophrenia. And so you start seeing visuals, and you think, oh shit, I've got schizophrenia. But really, there's some slight overlap, but the conditions are nothing alike in many important ways. But curiously, actually, as well as 1/3 of his patients being alcoholics, I think around 1/3 of Abraham's patients at least went on to develop psychosis. And that link between HPPD and later development of psychosis is something that's not really been explored much. So here's a chart which is, because of the wonders of screenshotting technology, isn't particularly clear. But this is HPPD's connections to all sorts of other conditions. So here's visual snow syndrome, hallucinogenic, what does that say? Non-hallucinogenic drug induction, SSRIs, I've mentioned. The benzodiazepine kratom stories. I haven't even mentioned antibiotics yet. Some people have either exacerbated their HPPD or caused HPPD-like effects from a round of antibiotics, epilepsy, migraine with aura, anxiety. People having anxiety attacks can see visual snow and after images and stuff. Psychosis spectrum disorders, head trauma, PTSD, depersonalization, generalization, which can have visual properties, especially tunnel vision, in the absence of any drug use, and neurodivergences. So I've read plenty of stories on the autism subreddit about people experiencing visual snow and after images and halos, and same with ADHD and complex PTSD. So there are all sorts of interconnections here, and I'm confident in predicting that the current entity of HPPD is unlikely to remain as it currently is, as this very psychedelic exclusive side effect. And so HPPD distress has these consistent thought patterns and destructive beliefs that drive the distress, and safety behaviors and behavioral patterns like monitoring and checking for symptoms. You'll be looking around the room thinking, oh shit, is the static still there? And these reassurance behaviors are exactly the kind of behaviors you see with many kinds of anxiety disorders, especially something like tinnitus. People will be constantly monitoring the levels of their tinnitus. And fascinatingly, I read the other day that the tinnitus research indicates that the actual intensity of the auditory tone of the tinnitus bears no consistent relation to the level of anxiety people feel. The real variables here are the anxious thoughts, the anxious behaviors, the constantly checking. And HPPD has been called a kind of visual tinnitus before. People might avoid environments that trigger their symptoms, but of course it's a safety behavior that only reinforces the anxious cycle of HPPD. So I for a period found it too distressing to get the London Underground because it was too overwhelming. But then a friend told me, you're only making it worse. So I had to bite the bullet and get it, and the tube is now fine. HPPD has a kind of visual tinnitus, and these psychotherapeutic case reports I described earlier of muscle relaxation and addressing people's core beliefs. So even in the early 70s, and this Matefi case report describes a 17-year-old he saw who got HPPD who got flashbacks, as it was called then, from a few bad trips. And this 17-year-old was had formed this new core belief that he was a freak, which is exactly the kind of core belief that many HPPDers have now. But you target the belief, you really consider its validity, you promote relaxation, you process the experience. And in all three of these case reports, they reported, as I said, significant reductions in anxiety and reductions in the visuals. You've got tinnitus. Here's an example of tinnitus. You hear the tone, you immediately feel anxious, and if it goes the wrong way, you think, I don't like my tinnitus, I hate it interrupts everything I do, it affects my relationships, my family, my job, that makes you more upset, and that reinforces the cycle. Whereas you can break the cycle by basically, in the case of, let's look at the case of HPPD. So you have a visual, and your visuals can be situationally dependent. It can be increased by stress, fatigue, enclosed environments, feeling really stimulated, maybe having taken another intoxicant, maybe you smoked weed, and that causes an initial emotional anxiety, an anxious spike. And if you approach HPPD the wrong way, it can activate these destructive beliefs like, I'm a freak, or thoughts like, I I've got brain damage, I'm on a never-ending trip, no one will ever understand me, looking around, monitoring your symptoms even more, whereas, and that maintains the cycle. Whereas if you approach the HPPD situationally, you actually look at, what could be maintaining my visuals, what could be increasing my visuals right now? Is there anything I can do? How can I take action? How can I address the source of stress or fatigue? Do I need to go to sleep? You do deep breathing. You actually critically evaluate the core beliefs and the thoughts that have arisen. Is it true that I'm on a never-ending trip? No, I last took LSD 4 years ago. I'm not on a never-ending trip. Will everyone judge me and hate me? No, people know I have HPPD, it's fine, they still love me, etc., etc. And through basically classic good old CBT, you can really treat your HPPD and maybe recover. And just to finish off, the spiritual qualities of HPPD. So people can report these very similar visual effects and the alterations to sense of self that we see with depersonalization, derealization, through things like meditation. So I've been told of visual snow-like effects being heralded as a sign of spiritual advancement in the Buddhist tradition, and I might be corrected on this. But in visualization meditation, I spoke to Daniel Ingram, and he tells me, who is a very advanced meditator, and he tells me that he has these kinds of visual phenomena quite intensely, and he uses them as part of his visualization meditation practice, especially a particular meditation style called Kasina meditation. I think he stares at a candle flame and then will just, trip balls, essentially. And then we'll just sort of manipulate his visuals in cool ways. And so I'm actually aware of, there is a Discord community of people with HPPD-like symptoms who use them in visualization meditation techniques, which is fascinating. And depersonalization, derealization is a really tricky condition to have if you're interested in spirituality, because there is the temptation to view these experiences as actually feeling pretty spiritual. When you feel depersonalized, it can feel like a no-self experience. And so but then at the same time, is the no-self experience we're having, is it really emerging from a healthy psyche? Derealization, is it ever healthy to feel like the world around you is a dream? And so it's really hard to sort the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. What is spiritual and what isn't, kind of on your own, because a lot of spirituality these days is conducted on a highly individualized basis. And there is a late 19th century book called Amiel's Journal, which was written by a literature scholar named Henri Frédéric Amiel, and he kept this journal for decades in which he experienced depersonalization, derealization like experiences before those were ever coined as terms, and he viewed them in spiritual ways, and he had many experiences of feeling like he was at one with God, but also felt the constant isolation and anxiety of derealization. And so there's the question of what is and isn't healthy as a tendency in the psyche. And many HPPDs can feel spiritually deprived after losing psychedelics as a tool. So at least speaking for myself, I've undergone this story of feeling depersonalized, derealized, and viewing it as something spiritual, and I don't trip anymore. So it's kind of hard to find spiritual nourishment sometimes. And resources. So the charity I work for has this information guide, which is very in-depth on HPPD. We have a directory of psychiatrists and care professionals. The basis of my HPPD CBT concept was as well as tinnitus, depersonalization, derealization. And Elaine Hunter is a British clinical psychologist who's an expert in depersonalization, and and a very good commentator and all this stuff. So that's the end of my talk.
Yeah.